Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank SMU and especially the president, Professor Arnold, the mayor, and all the faculty members and senior members of the board of SMU who have made this possible. And I want to thank the students, teachers, and all the stakeholders to SMU in making this a success. If we take a look at the world today, the US economy has gone through a bit of a slowdown and been able to muddle through with 1.5%, 2% growth rate. And it is viewed that it is probably growing at about 6 to 7% lower than what it should be. Whereas in Europe, we're seeing the trends of kicking the can down the road for the last few years, and it seems that it's likely to continue for another year or two. China has felt it. They've been able to create so much capacity in view of the growing demand that would come from the developed economies in Europe and the US and also in Asia Pacific, increasingly in Africa and Latin America. But by way of the slowdown in the US and Europe, the capacity that was created runs at a lower utilization rate. As a result of which, they needed to reconfigure the economic structure to try to domesticate it a little bit more, a la Indonesia style. Because if you want to be more consumptive, you need to make sure that there is youth, that there is reproduction. Sort of what we've gone through in Indonesia the last few years. Demographically, Indonesia has been blessed, but demographically, Indonesia could be cursed too if we don't do anything good to the young people that enter the world. The BRICS, as you know, have been slowing down, with the exception of China coming down to 7.5%. Relative to the others, it's doing fantastically. And the BRIC countries, or the BRICS countries, have been over-relying on demands coming from Europe and the US, and some of them have been over-relying on commodities. Brazil, as a result, grew at less than 1% last year and is trying to figure out a way. The world seems to lack and be in need of a new source of oracular economic wisdom. That is something what everybody's searching, whether it's in Indonesia, Singapore, ASEAN, Asia Pacific, and the greater world. This is the spirit of bilateralism that we're seeing in many parts of the world, whether it's in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, or even in Europe. Some even go to the extent of a plurilateral understanding or undertaking. Some will take the regional approach in hopes that those things, whether it's bilateral, plurilateral, or regional, would be in complementarity and supportive of the spirit of multilateralism that would have been spearheaded at Doha. And that was 11 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. It's been very difficult to advance the agenda and spirit that would basically bridge the interest of the poor and those of the developing and those of the developed. It's a challenging time. Another example would be the initiative of some of the developed economies to go ahead with a Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative. At the same time when Asian economies are trying to move ahead with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnerships, or RCEP. But unfortunately or fortunately, this sits on the back of a developing geopolitical situation, whether it relates to what's happening up north between Japan and China and Korea, and what's happening in the South China Sea, as we're seeing the US trying to better re-engage the ASEAN population, the ASEAN countries and economies. The ASEAN Free Trade Agreement is a beautiful, beautiful framework. This has promoted economic activities in all countries involved. We have to make sure that the domestic politics is manageable so that it becomes a sustainable thing between China and Indonesia through ASEAN. And we're hopeful that by infusing the investment thesis and increasing capacity in Indonesia through technological transfer and financial capital transfer, we would be able to sustain it. And I do believe we will. Policies that have been designed by countries to spur growth, to better the foundation for economic development, sometimes tend to get lost in translation. Because beliefs and policies are malleable. Malleable to the extent that the stronger do have the propensity to affect how things get perceived. That's the global stuff. The second is on Indonesia. At the end of Sukarno, or his regime, the GDP per capita of Indonesia was at a mere $400. Then Suharto took over. At the end of his term, the GDP per capita of Indonesia was $600. And the transition government of Habibie, Megawati, Gus Dur brought the GDP per capita from $600 to about $1,100. Until 2004, when SBY, or Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, took over and started and continued the reform agenda that was started earlier. By the end of last year, Indonesia's GDP per capita was about $4,000. And if we were to extrapolate the economy until the end of his term in October 22nd next year, there's a good chance the GDP per capita of Indonesia would be about $5,000. So that would mean the quintupling of the GDP per capita of Indonesia within a 10-year period, ever since SBY took over from Megawati. We take a look at the fiscal posture. Indonesia may have some bragging rights. We run on a debt to GDP ratio of about 23%. And we've been running a budget deficit of about 1.5% each of the last few years. Last year's inflation was a little under 4%. In 2011, it was 3.5%. We've been able to manage inflation quite effectively and efficiently. I think from a monetary and fiscal standpoint, Indonesia stands pretty ready. And by the way, only 10 million people pay taxes in Indonesia. With only 10 million people and companies paying taxes, we've been able to reduce our debt to GDP ratio to 23%. We've been able to manage budget deficit at about 1.5%. We've been able to offer companies that have gone public to pay tax at a 20% tax rate. And our tax ratio has gone up to about 15.5% using the OECD methodology. By next year, there's going to be about 170 million Indonesians who will be female and youthful, who will be eligible to vote. Think about that. They will shape not just the political process, but they will shape the economic process and the social process, the cultural process of Indonesia. There are many challenges for Indonesia. How the hell do we use this fiscal space so that everybody gets to enjoy the cake? The MDGs, I think, are likely to be fulfilled by 2015. We'll probably be able to achieve an unemployment rate of 4 to 5% by next year. poverty rate of about 6 to 7% by next year. The next challenge is how to make Indonesia more competitive. More competitive by replacing and embellishing the hopelessly antiquated infrastructure that you might have seen. Traffic jams are emblematic of economic growth. But the question is anybody thinking about fixing it soon? That's what we've got to figure out soon. And as we have fiscally decentralized to the 33 provinces and 497 kabupatens or regencies and municipalities, I think we're on the right track. But the question has always been and will be for a bit with respect to the quality of spending. We're allocating close to 50% of the budget into the regions, but if we did a pulse check yesterday, many of the provincial leaderships, kabupaten leaderships, are still using their budget to buy clothes, to build houses, and to buy cars instead of building roads and power plants and things that would actually help the future of the provincial government and the people within the provinces. That's the kind of quality that we have to basically drive towards going forward. The directionality is clear. It's moving in the right direction. Money-wise, it's being thrown into regions more and more. Yes, there has been leakage. Money-wise, it has been spent on better quality stuff. Yes, it's not where we want it to be. But if we take a 5-10 year view, I think there's a chance that it will be at the level that we want it to be. Investment has risen, and it's reflective of a better investment climate. Yesterday we announced the latest figures on investment. Indonesia recorded 83 trillion rupees worth of realized investments in the fourth quarter, totaling to about $33 to $34 billion worth of capital formation. 30% of which is local capital formation, 70% FDI. And the good news is only 17% of FDI was related to mining. The rest is actually going to infrastructure, serves things that actually help Indonesia move up the ladder, move up the value chain. The other good news is money is actually being dispersed out of Java. In 2009, only 18% of total capital formation was invested outside Java. 2012, 46%. 46% of total capital formation took place outside Java. It's good. Not only is the money moving out of Java and being spread all across the 33 provinces, but it's actually being invested in stuff that actually allows us to move up the value chain. And thanks to Singapore, by the way, for being the #1 investor. Year by year, the Americans have shut up to being one of the top 5 investors in Indonesia. They get it. They see this burgeoning economy full of 250 million people who consume. McKinsey issued a report saying that today's 55 million people making up the middle class will only grow to about 115 million people by 2030, positioning Indonesia potentially as the 7th largest economy in the world. The 2 key drivers of Indonesia's economy have been domestic consumption and investments. And those 2 are likely to continue in the near foreseeable future. Last year, Indonesia recorded a GDP of about $1 trillion. If we were to just hypothetically extrapolate the economy growing at 5% real growth, put on top of that 5% inflation rate, let it grow year on year for 20 years, barring catastrophic scenarios that could disrupt the trajectory, we could end up with a GDP of $6 to $7 trillion 20 years from today. If we were to accumulate all the GDPs going from $1 trillion last year ending up with 6 to 7 trillion US dollars 20 years from today. The accumulation of the GDPs of Indonesia over a 20-year period is about 60 trillion US dollars. So if we were to assume that the government will stay on course in terms of spending 20% of its budget on education, which we're mandated to do by way of the Constitution that was amended a few years ago, the government will be spending $2.4 trillion in the next 20 years. That's 20% of the 12 trillion US dollars on education. Sure, there's a possibility of externalities or catastrophic scenarios that could disrupt the trajectory, but if that were to go in a linear fashion at just 5% real growth, we've got a chance at educating Indonesia better and bigger. The problem is, today Indonesia only has 20,000 PhDs. China has 600,000 PhDs. India has 600,000 PhDs. We don't have not only enough PhDs, we don't have enough masters, bachelors, ITE graduates, and plumbers. So we've got to start somewhere. And the good thing is we've got the fiscal space to do it. So if we can achieve this 2.4 trillion US dollars in the next 20 years, we can spend it right, I think we can have a better future. I think we can be relevant. I think we can start thinking about being side by side with China, with India, with Brazil, with South Korea. The moment we can only be proud of having a large scale and being able to sell coal and palm oil. Can't even make iPhones. That's a sad truth. But there's a growing number of Indonesians who see the glass half full. And that's what matters. Last year, the Ministry of Trade sent 111 of its staff overseas to Singapore, Australia, Japan, the US, and Europe. The year before, we only sent 3. We've got the money now. We can actually allocate budget for the purpose of sending people to get better educated. So the possibilities are quite enormous. Politics and economics are related, and they tend to influence each other. We're all aware that this prolonged slump has the ability of affecting adversely the democratic values and institutions. I think what's important and relevant is that we've got to be able to continue this democratization on a path, but mix that with the institutionalization. But we can't have an institutionalization of democracy if we don't have the right people sitting at the different institutions. We can't have that now because we just don't have as many educated people as we should. But going back to the fiscal space reference, I think we've got a chance. The debate about the future will linger from a political standpoint. And I think time will tell. And if one were to size up and assess what would be the main legacies of SBY by 2014 when he steps down, I think the first legacy would be the trajectory of sustained economic development. The second would be the consolidation of ideologies. I remember 1998 when we just learned about democracy as Suharto stepped down. We had more than 100 parties. The last election we had 34 parties. For next year, we're only going to have 10 parties. And you're seeing a rise of the nationalist agenda holders, which I think has a good probability of securing policy continuity post-SBY, post-2014. And that's good for business. That's good for Singapore. That's good for ASEAN. But first of all, it's good for Indonesia, because that's the track and the path we want to stay on. The rule of law is important. We get hammered all the time for not being able to deliver legal certainties. Not all the time, but many times. And you guys know it better than I do. You, Singapore being the biggest investor, have not seen it perfect in Indonesia. There have been imperfections, admittedly. And we've got to make sure that this gets fixed. Because if we have the necessary rule of law, there will be level playing field with the Indias of the world, with the Chinas of the world. There will be level playing field for ASEAN with the rest of the world. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult. See, I always see whatever happens to Indonesia happens to Singapore in a lot of ways. Whatever we have to export and import has to go through Singapore. If Indonesia grows, Singapore will inevitably grow. Basically, Indonesia has been able to afford to buy bread. In the future, we just got to make sure we can put something in between. Thank you very much. All right.